morning. This is the December 19th meeting of the Vermont Task Force to Revitalize the Dairy Industry. Guess we will start with introductions, going around the room first.
Senator Bobby Starr, co-chair of the task force from the Orleans Essex Senate District.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Mike Markoff from Coventry, representing Coventry, Irisburg, Newport City, Newport Town, and I also chair House Commerce and Economic Development.
My name is Michael O'Grady. I'm legislative counsel.
I'm Dan Smith, an attorney specializing in milk market regulation, practicing in Montpelier, and co-chair with Senator Starr. Moving to the screen, Senator Brock.
I'm Senator Randy Brock. I represent Franklin County and Alberg in Grand Isle County. I'm a member of the Senate Finance Committee, and I'm the Senate Minority Leader.
Representative O'Brien.
Good morning. I'm John O'Brien. I represent Royalton in my hometown of Tunbridge, and I serve on the House Committee on Agriculture and Forestry.
Jackie.
Good morning. I'm Jackie Folsom. I'm a retired dairy farmer in East Cabot, Vermont, and legislative director for the Vermont Farm Bureau and the Vermont Fairs and Field Days Association.
And John.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Roberts. I'm the executive director of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, a farmer advocacy group based in Middlebury, Vermont.
Thank you, everybody.
We have Linda.
Oh, and excuse me, and Linda in the corner.
We have Linda stuck in the corner over here.
Linda Lehman, our staff assistant, very important. We're convening today to review the draft report to the legislature that Mike O'Grady put together following our meeting 2 weeks ago, at which we discussed our different proposed recommendations. So the first item of business is to have Mike go through the draft report for us.
Good morning. This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. First, I want to note that the draft is a draft. The editors did not have time to proof the document on Friday because of a backlog of Senate bills that they are proofing. So I will walk through the report at a high level. I won't read it or focus too much on detail. You'll see that there is a table of contents on page 2, laying out the sections of the report. The first section is the statutory charge, which is something that the task force reviewed at its first meeting. On page 5, you will see before going on to 5, you'll see the creation of the task force and the requirement to create a joint committee of legislators and other experts, and for those experts to develop legislation to implement the recommendations of the Commissioner of Financial Regulation. Now, the Commissioner of Financial Regulation was required by Act 129 to issue recommendations for revising regulated dairy pricing and other market regulation in the state to improve future viability of the Vermont dairy farming. So that is what the task force is tasked with doing, is implementing those recommendations from DFR. On page 6, you'll see the members of the task force. I won't go through them. You are all here except for Heather Darby. And then you come to page 7, which is an overview of the issue. The first paragraph discusses the importance of farming to Vermont economics, dairy farming specifically, and to the landscape and culture of Vermont. The second paragraph notes that there has been a decline in the number of farms, and that the loss of farms poses a real threat to Vermont's historic core, its economy, character, and landscape. Then discusses the market changes that have occurred in Vermont from, in the third paragraph, historically, as much as 90% of the state's raw milk was marketed out of state. That has changed You'll see in the fourth paragraph that approximately 81.5% of the pooled raw milk is staying in state, and that this has basically led to a new supply pattern. However, even though the processors are making more products in state, dairy farmers are still suffering because of the inability to control pricing. You'll see that on page 8, first paragraph. The primary reason for the exit of dairy farming operations is that Vermont dairy farmers still cannot control the price of raw milk. The fundamental cause for that is the federal milk market order and its current lack of basically recognizing the cost of production that farmers have. It has led to volatile producer pricing, actually harm rather than benefit farm operations. And then on top of the the milk market order pricing, there are additional fees and subcharges levied by cooperatives that increase the cost of production further. The General Assembly determined a need for bold and innovative state action and enacted Act 129 to have DFR do a assessment of the long-term sustainability of Vermont dairy farming under the existing FMMO pricing system, current market conditions, and dairy cooperative operation. DFR issued its assessment report on January 15th, 2021. The department concluded that Vermont dairy industry is struggling primarily as a result of the imbalance between high cost of production and the low milk market order minimum prices, but also compounded by COVID-19. The department concluded that changes to the market order could help ensure better prices, and the department asserted that it's worth considering efforts to supplement the market order, including risk management programs and state milk pricing. In addition, in the intervening time between the DFR report and the convening of the task force, there was an important event, significant development, that was the appropriation of federal funding for infrastructure improvements. The availability of that funding and its broad application created unprecedented opportunity for the state to help stabilize the Vermont dairy industry. And on page 9, you'll see on May 3rd, 2021, the task force convened. It held 10 meetings. It heard from multiple witnesses representing all facets of the industry. And the report includes the task force's recommendations on multiple categories of initiatives. There are short-term and long-term initiatives. There are some initiatives that will take time to implement, but there are some that could be implemented quickly that would provide farmers with immediate consequential support. And then the last sentence is the state has lost almost 60% of its dairy farms in the past 20 years. Every action should be explored and every effort made to ensure that the state does not lose more. Then on page 9, you come to the task force recommendations. The first is a risk management category, and the first recommendation under risk management is for the state to pay the premiums for farmer participation in risk management programs. You heard from a few witnesses about the different USDA risk management programs: dairy margin coverage program, dairy revenue protection, and livestock gross margin. You also heard that some states, specifically Virginia and Maryland, are paying the farmer premiums for dairy margin coverage. So this would kind of follow Virginia and Maryland in the recommendation to pay for premiums for farmer participation in any of the 3 risk management programs: DMC, DRP, or LGM. There is a cost estimate of what it would cost the state to pay the premiums for DMC. It's harder to calculate the premiums for DRP and LGM because that will depend on farmer participation, and currently there are not that many farmers participating in DRP in Vermont, only 3. And LGM, I could not get a number for that, but it's not I can't even estimate how many are in LGM right now. But with DMC, we generally know what it would cost, and it would basically come out to an annual premium cost to the state of 1.9 million, and a total cost for 2 years of 3.8 million. And that would be at the $9.50 margin coverage level, up to 5 million pounds of milk production per farmer. And so that was the first recommendation. The second recommendation is to increase farmer participation in the risk management programs. As I noted already, there are only 3 Vermont farmers participating in DRP. We haven't been able to estimate how many are in LGM. And the second recommendation is for the committees on agriculture to determine why more farmers are not participating, and then unless some other unknown concerns warrant that farmers not participate, that the task force recommend state take additional efforts to increase long-term participation by Vermont farmers in these risk management programs. The third recommendation on the risk management is to advocate for the extension and reauthorization of the risk mitigation programs. DMC is set to expire after 2023. So this recommends that the Farm Bill reauthorize the program and similarly reauthorize DRP and LGM. Then on page 11, you're into the second category of recommendations. The first is for price stabilization and enhancement. The first is basically that risk management programs that we just discussed help to provide price stabilization, and therefore the task force recommends that the state pursue those risk management recommendations as short-term price stabilization tools. Second category is the milk market order reform. You heard from several witnesses that the order needs to be revised and amended to more accurately represent or reflect the cost of productions to dairy farmers and to minimize the price volatility under the order. So that is basically what that second category does. It recognizes that multiple entities have requested market order reform, including a group of farmers that testified to Congress in September. The American Farm Bureau platform has market order reform on it. The Vermont Milk Commission in 2018 recommended order reform, and DFR also recommended order reform in its report. The pending reauthorization of the federal farm bill is an opportunity for needed reform. However, the task force heard that it's probably unlikely that the 2023 farm bill will include comprehensive market order reform. And likely, if it's going to occur, would happen according to the traditional order reform process, rulemaking. But that does not basically does not mean that the task force should not recommend that there be order reform as soon as possible. And then in sub 3 on page 12, bottom of the page, the next category is recommendation of state regulatory milk market order pricing program. It is a state action separate from the federal milk market order, similar to what other states have done, Virginia, Montana, and Maine, parts of New York, parts of Pennsylvania, and previously California. The program act to regulate the price paid by in-state milk plants for their in-state raw milk supplies. Vermont Milk Commission has this authority already. They have the authority to establish by order a minimum or maximum price and to set an equitable minimum price to be paid to dairy producers for milk produced in Vermont. The task force recognizes that the commission has not exercised this authority. One of the potential actions that could be taken by the legislature is to direct the commission to exercise its authority to set a minimum price by order of the federal milk market order. On page 14, there's a an issue with the formatting. There's a page break that needs to be removed. And then that brings you to the fourth category. It's a legal inquiry and review of state regulatory pricing or the raw milk use tax. You heard several proposals and testimony from Maine regarding their existing program where they pay out of the general fund subsidy payments to their farmers. The subsidy payments are funded in part by an imposition of a handling fee on raw milk. So this is basically to study the legal viability of such a program in Vermont. Vermont's system is different from Maine. Therefore, there's more opportunity for legal challenge, getting a third-party disinterested legal analysis of the constitutionality of such a pricing system would be helpful, and then would allow the task force to move on that further at a later date. Similarly, actually on page 16, there is the discussion of Senator Brock's proposal of a fee on the retail sale of packaged milk products for advertising funding. The fee would be on any product, fluid product labeled as milk, including plant-based beverages labeled as milk, collected by the product distributor on the distributor's receipt of products, or by a manufacturer if the product is directly distributed by the manufacturer, would not be directly imposed on consumers. Data is needed to determine the amount of revenue that could be generated. If the revenue is sufficient, the fee could be used to expand the marketing of Vermont dairy milk in state and out of state, focusing on its quality and purity, and the general superiority of Vermont dairy products. Then you get to the next category of recommendations, that's infrastructure support. You heard that there is significant federal money coming. Vermont has 500 million in ARPA funds that it needs to spend, most likely in budget adjustment. Then under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, it's Vermont is scheduled to receive 2.1 billion. In addition, there are many federal programs that receive money underneath the IIJA. And so there's money available from the federal government as well, not just through the state. So the first recommendation here is the General Assembly should review existing financing programs available to dairy farmers or related businesses to identify where programs can be expanded or established to provide short-term assistance from available ARPA and IIJA funds. There are existing programs that are likely to get money from ARPA and IIJA, and you can look to see if they should be expanded. Working Lands is one. Capital Equipment Assistance Program is another, and there are other programs that you could look at for expansion to address infrastructure needs on farms. There are two examples that are given: one, driveways and farm roads, because you heard from milk haulers that there are sometimes issues with accessing farms because of driveway and farm road. And then you heard about bulk tanks and cooling systems, expanding them, or providing adequate cooling systems so that there's a need for fewer truck stops, and that more milk can be transported in individual loads. Then on page 17, one of the issues you've heard about is accessing these funds. Farmers don't necessarily have time or understand the process. Sometimes the process is difficult. So one of the things that's recommended is that there be grant writers funded to help farmers access these federal funds over the next 2 years. The recommendation discusses the READY program, which was enacted about 3 years ago, and it provided $150,000 to VHCB for grant writing assistance, and it's brought down well over $3 million at this point, but I only had a site to 2.3 million for towns and businesses, with another 2.5 million in the pipeline for additional funding. Then you get to the next category, it's transportation. You've heard about hauling costs being an issue. I believe, Jackie, this is something that you brought up, how it's a significant cost to farmers, and how the state has pursued in the past a way to shift it. It's difficult to do. There's always pushback, and there is opportunity for unintended consequences, such as fee shifting. So the task force recommends that the agricultural committees explore alternatives for shifting the cost of hauling from dairy farmers to other sources. On page 18, you heard issues about highway weights and non-conformity with other states, thereby requiring milk haulers to use different trucks for Vermont or to not be able to do the most efficient routes. So the recommendation is for the transportation committees to review conforming weight limits on Vermont highways with neighboring states in order to facilitate regional dairy hauling. Then the next subcategory is labor. And you heard multiple witnesses testify about the current labor shortage and how it's negatively affecting farm and dairy processing production. So the first recommendation is to increase the CDL assistance program at the Vermont Department of Labor to explore ways to enhance that program or promote its availability, or provide bonuses or additional financing for those participants committing to drive for a milk hauler or dairy processor. Or similar bonuses that were discussed or incentives for people that are working in the dairy processing industry, such as housing, that could attract them to work for a dairy processor. And then third, there's a recommendation of looking at apprenticeship programs that the state could explore to attract individuals to the farming profession. I discussed the main apprenticeship program that's out there, main meaning the most significant, and the dairy grazing apprenticeship program, and how it sets up, connects individuals with farms across the nation, and that helps with farm transition and helps prevent farm loss. Then on page 19, the next category is purchasing, and having the corrections committees, institutions committees, and education committees discuss with state agencies why they are not purchasing Vermont dairy products when there is a directive in statute for them to buy those dairy products, with all other issues being equal. The next subcategory or category is processing capacity, about exploring in the state where processing capacity can be increased, whether or not that's through attracting a national or regional dairy processor for a new plant, or looking at where unused capacity is in the state and whether that's available for other processors. And then the last category of recommendation is page 19 going on to page 20, a recommendation to extend the authority of the task force. The task force is basically scheduled to expire on March 1, 2022. This would recommend that its authority be extended to February 1, 2023, and that an additional 10 meetings for the task force be. Then you get to the conclusion. It's a general discussion of the report and the need for action because of a lot of dairy farms over the past 20 years. How the farmers are dealing with pricing volatility, production costs, transportation issues, labor issues, and how the state needs to take some action based on the recommendations of the task force to help prevent the continued loss of dairy farms in the state and Vermont, and return Vermont dairy farming to a profitable and sustainable operation. Then I included on page 21 a link to the DFR report. I didn't want to put the whole DFR report in as an appendix, but I thought it was helpful if somebody wanted to go explore what the DFR report said, for them to have that resource. And then the last 4 pages are some draft legislation. The first main section is page 1, line 13, section 2. It's the premium assistance program to pay for farmer participation in risk management programs for DMC, DRP, and LGM. And then on page, well, it says page 1 of 4, which is something that needs to change, but it's section 3. It's capital assistance. This amends to the existing capital assistance program, and you'll see that it would then authorize use of the money under that program for purchase of bulk tanks or cooling systems for a farm when such a purchase will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the number of truck trips to the farm annually. Section 5 is a direct appropriation of ARPA funds to working lands to provide grants for Vermont farmers to stabilize driveways and farm roads in order to allow for continued or increased truck traffic by milk haulers. I talked to the agency about how best to do the driveways and farm roads. They don't want it in a water quality program because then it gets kind of bogged down and all the conditions for water quality. So they want it under working lands or a similarly independent program from water quality. So that's why it's set up this way instead of it being a water quality program. And then the last section, major section, is the continuation of the task force, moving it from its authority from March 1, 2022 to February 1, 2023. And then on line 6 of that last page, giving the authority for 10 additional meetings. And then the entire act would be effective on passage, but that's really to address the need to move the ARPA funds as soon as possible. Report. Again, it needs to be edited, and there's some formatting issues, but that should be easy enough to deal with.
Thank you, Mike. So for the task force discussion, I propose that we start with questions from task force members to Michael, and then we can proceed with comments from task force members. So open up for anybody with questions for Michael.
Well, I'd just like to say thank Michael for all the time and energy that he has given us as a task force. And, you know, I think there's a lot here. We've talked about all these things since we've been coming to the meetings and heard testimony. I haven't got any, I don't believe I have any direct changes that I'd propose at this point. But I think I just wanted to thank Michael for all of his work and time he put into putting this together for us.
Representative Markup.
Mike, first on page 7, in the second paragraph, when we talk about the loss of dairy farms in the state, and we talk about the lands that are lost. I think larger farms are taking on more of the animals that the smaller farms had. So I guess I just want to make sure we're accurate, that we're losing actual land, or is it just shifting to another large farm? And then, you know, we've lost farms, but our animal counts are still staying high, as far as from what I understand. But
You know, in an earlier version, I wrote about how the production amount is basically the same. It's 2.6 billion right now, currently, but it was 2.7 billion 20 years ago. It's really not that big of a difference. And how that's been basically driven by economies of scale, of trying to achieve a margin and drive, you know, spread your cost of production so you can eke out a profit. I mean, I can include something like that if you would like.
Cow numbers are down, like there's fewer cows. So production per cow is up substantially. So
so they're able to continue staying pretty much on an even keel in production, but by doing it economically, being able to produce more from smaller herds of animals.
you know, there's a lot of factors, you know, that have gone in, and I think, I'm not aware, Jackie or John, or as far as the land base, what the conversion to bigger farms has done to the actual land base under control of the dairy industry.
Yeah, I have heard anecdotally, Dan, and I'm glad you brought this up, Michael, because I had that on my list too. The production hasn't gone down, as Mr. O'Grady said, because the cows are more efficient. But the land base, I don't think we've lost as much land base as people think, because the larger farms or the neighboring farms are using it for cropland. So I'm not sure that there has been a significant loss of land base as far as dairy farming is concerned. But that's anecdotal. I've heard from several farmers that had read this and were concerned that that was not in there. So thank you for bringing it up.
The intriguing question, though, is that the larger farms tend to take the more productive land when they take over a farming operation, and not necessarily the land that holds the whole farm together. So how that has worked over time is just interesting.
Well, they take the land that's closest to them. And if that's the land that's more productive, that's obviously what they need. I mean, I don't, you know, as far as if you're talking about grazing versus cropland, the larger farms don't tend to use that, but they would still need cropland. So I'm not sure I'd agree with that assessment.
I'm not making an assessment. I'm posing a question for.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think it may vary in different parts of the state, Dan. I know around us in Addison County, there is very strong competition for any land that comes up available, not just from the LFOs in the area, but also MFOs, and even some small farms. I think it's very hard. I mean, I know that data that I've seen, you know, the state generally is losing land to development bit by bit. That is basically understandable. We may want to, I mean, I think that's a different issue, but mostly around us, I can think of 4 or 5 farms that have gone out of business, but the land is being farmed by others now, and successfully, I guess. Just quickly, I'd like to commend Michael for this report. I think it's very good. I did wonder whether it would be appropriate or nice to at least list everybody who testified, you know, as to demonstrate, you know, we got a pretty complete picture from all the different groups who testified. It's just a thought.
Is that?
If I can add that as an appendix, all the witnesses are listed on the committee's website, and it would not be difficult for me to develop a document that I could add as an appendix of everyone and their title or organization.
That'd be great. I added them up. There's well over 50 witnesses that we heard from. John O'Brien has his virtual hand up.
Jackie, did you have a question? I know your hand was up earlier.
No, I was just going to make comments. So go ahead, John. I'll wait.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. Well, a quick comment on the loss of farms versus, or perhaps the same amount of cows or the same amount of production, is that whole issue of social capital or community capital. It'd be much better to have 1,000 dairy farms than 100 in the state, even if we had the same amount of production. Because when I think of dairy farmers, even in this town, they live in town, and I bet, percentage wise, they're the ones who, the chair of our select board is a dairy farmer, or the people who run the Tunbridge Fair are dairy farmers. So there's a value to keeping more dairy farmers than less. As far as a question I had was, Representative Dave Iacovone forwarded a Vermont Digger article. I don't know if anybody saw it, from last week, about how Leahy, at the federal level, they were changing one of the dairy risk management programs based on how much it cost to feed cows. And it was going from, it was complicated. It was all about conventional alfalfa to premium alfalfa. But I just wondered how was that something new that just happened, or has this been around a while and we knew it was coming? And the other part was that it claimed that a very high percentage of Vermont dairy farmers were already getting, some sort of risk management payback. So I don't know what people heard about that.
Yeah. So, John, go ahead. O'Brien, Roberts.
It's tricky when there's two of us. So just commenting on John's article. Or John's comment, sorry. We knew that Senator Leahy was attempting, and others were attempting, to adjust the DNC program to take a better account of feed numbers, which were basically inaccurate before. I just before we got onto this meeting today, I read an article in Dairy Herd Management that touted that they expect this will have a very beneficial effect to those farmers who have received payments. And I was just a while ago, I had a chart that showed state by state what each state received. Hang on, I'm getting there. Vermont received $26,132,676 of an average farm payment of over 54,000 per farm. 481 farms actually got money, applied or were membership. So percentage enrolled was 73.5% of our farmers. So there's some numbers that are on the USDA FSA website today.
So, John, they've been making, the program has been around in 2 iterations for 2 farm bills, and they've been making improving changes over time to both the premium structure and to the calculation of the payment. And the latest change was, as you described, to the feed, and John Roberts described, to the feed cost element of the calculation in the dairy margin coverage program, so that farmers will be receiving more as they've made the calculation more accurate. So the numbers John Roberts that you mentioned, that's just for this year. The previous years, there was less participation by farmers in the state. And so I think what we're proposing to do is to reinforce the effectiveness of this program by really saying that the state is making available premium coverage to take that unknown away from farmers. The farmers have had to decide whether it's worth risking the premium to participate in the program. And what we're offering is there's no more risk to participating, so you can only receive the benefit if you participate. So it's to both acknowledge that over the 2 farm bill period, they've really made a program that works, and also to make that the possibility of participating in a program that works more possible for Vermont farmers.
And I thought we heard testimony that from somebody, they felt very sure that this would get continued into the next farm bill. There's strong possibility that it would continue. Do you recall that?
Well, Jim Mulhern from National Milk testified that there'll be a strong push for it to be reauthorized. And so that it's important for the state to get behind that effort to reauthorize it, because it's working. That was his testimony. But it's up for reauthorization doesn't mean it will.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Randy, Senator Brock.
Thank you. First, a very small thing. On page 10, the last paragraph of page 10, I think there's a word missing. The task force recommends that the Joint Fiscal Office work with.
Yep.
So that's the small issue. The big issue, as I sit back and read the entire report, and I look at what this task force is charged ostensibly to do, is a task force to look at the revitalization of the dairy industry in Vermont. And if you add up all of the recommendations that we have in the report, with the possible exception of changes in the federal marketing order, is what we're doing actually going to revitalize anything? I would really love to see, and I know we're not positioned to be able to do that, the quantification of all of these recommendations, if they were enacted, as to A, how much they would cost, and or how much they would save the dairy farmer. And would it really make a difference? And I come away with this with just a nagging feeling in my stomach that it's not enough, particularly where there's doubt regarding the likelihood of the federal marketing order changing substantially enough to make a big difference. And perhaps those of you who are closer to the industry have a better feeling of this than I do. I'm kind of looking at the numbers and the language and the wording and the history, as opposed to having in-depth knowledge of the operations. But that's how I come away from that. This not nagging feeling that this doesn't revitalize the dairy industry.
But if I just might make a suggestion, that's a compelling question for the task force discussion, and see if Jackie, if you had a question about the report itself, or wording changing to the report itself before we get to the next step of the task force discussion. Is that okay, Randy? If we just
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So Jackie, did you have a question about the wording in the report itself?
Well, I did, and then I'd like to comment to Senator Brock too. So on page 17, under hauling costs, it says, number 1, the second line, dairy cooperatives require their members to pay the cost of hauling milk from the farm. I think the caveat is, I'm not sure organic cooperatives require payment, so you might want to check on that, Michael. I know that convention, Agrimark and DFA do, but I think that was also one of the pieces that was helpful to the organic farmers was that they got a better price, but they also didn't pay hauling, as far as I know. So that was just a, the other thing was, I accept your explanation about the agency not wanting to handle the, any grant activities for the milk tanks and the driveways, but I do have a challenge putting it into WeLab just because I'm not sure that I'm concerned about that. The comment I would like to make is, I do agree with.
Jackie, just let's see if there's any other questions about the draft itself.
Okay.
John O'Brien, did you have a question or suggestion about the report itself?
I didn't see anything in the report or anything that the task force proposed about the issue of retirement and succession. And I don't know if we had anything concrete, but it would be nice to mention, somewhere in there that we considered that, and maybe there are potential, at least long-term incentives we could come up with to make get more dairy farmers in and give a smoother exit to those who want to get out.
I don't know if we had a comment in regards to that issue, John, I think, if I remember right, but.
It was John's comment.
Pardon?
It was John raised it at our.
Oh, John raised it himself.
Yeah.
But we really didn't get any resolve to that, that I recall.
Do you have any thoughts, Mike, about?
There is one reference to it in the report. It's under the apprenticeship program and how bringing apprentices to the state can help provide, a transition for a farm to help prevent farm loss. That's the only reference. In the past, the agency has discussed about ways to encourage young farmers to match them with farms that are getting older, farmers that are getting older, and to create ways to transition, usually through some sort of land trust or VHCV program. So those are the existing programs that are out there. You could recommend that the state invest more money in those or resources to help the transition. It is a time of general appropriations availability.
If I might, I've been, I got asked to serve to establish a position in the Bar Association that would make legal services more available for farmers. And there are a few practitioners who are in this field. The problem is matching them with farmers. So I think to Mike's point, if there was some funding available, then I think both the lawyers and the farmers would be more receptive to the idea of taking that next step of participating in some succession planning, because it's always been a disconnect trying to match up farmers in one part of the state with farmers in another part of the state, or even lawyers in one community with the farmers in the same community. So that would just be a suggested follow-up to what you're thinking, John.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Just a further comment, Dan and
Yes,
John,
John,
on that. I mean, the UVM does have people in their program that can help farmers in this transition. I think the biggest roadblock is convincing a farmer that there comes a point when you cannot farm anymore, and you need to think about this. I certainly know in my time with the agency, when I saw many farms in the state, I saw far too many where particularly sons and hopefully it will extend to daughters down the road, but particularly sons were in their 40s and 50s and really didn't have a stake in the equity of the farm at that age, and that's too late.
Yeah.
It needs to be thought of much earlier.
So it's, I think it's an important addition is to bring in the VHCB and UVM have tried to do something with succession planning as part of business planning as well. And so we should incorporate that into the design. And that does raise the other issue. We had talked about business planning and we've heard some testimony about that. And I don't, whether that's something we never really.
Well, the farm
Jackie,
viability.
you raised that question, Jackie, about, who and how is the business planning been operating? Sorry, Bobby.
Well, I was just going to state the farm viability program was established for that purpose, and it would be a good place to add that in, right in with the succession plan.
Yeah.
Well, I think the discussion we had was that there are a lot of technical service providers. Oops, am I still mute now? There are a lot of technical service providers out there, but we don't know who they are and what their expertise is. And I think I had asked for a consideration of a listing or something, or one-stop shopping for the farmers so that they could determine, because it's my understanding that the farmers are not, they're not asked who they get to connect with as a technical service provider. So sometimes it's not a good fit. And that was my concern, was that do we have the right people with the right background to help the farmers at the time with what the farmers themselves are asking for, as opposed to just hooking them up with somebody and hoping that works. So that was the discussion that we had.
Can we take notice of that?
And the other thing is most of these things are going to require some type of legislation. And as we go through that process, of course, we're going to get comments and suggestions from a host of different people that, the committee would add to a bill dealing with things such as this that's in our report. So.
And that was the one thing I wanted to make a comment on. I really commend the report on the fact that they're moving this discussion out of the ag committees, because we've been advocating that for a long, long time by putting it into finance, by putting it into economic development, by putting it into, the other committees that are mentioned. It gets the discussion out there to recognize the importance of the dairy committee, not just to agriculture and land use, but to everything else that's going on in the state. And I really, really appreciate the fact that there are recommendations that this be discussed in other committees. And I think that goes a long way to, I agree with Senator Brock about we probably need to quantify what these recommendations will do directly to dairy farmers. And that might be hard, except for some of them where we have hard figures, such as the DMC payments and money for the roads and the tanks. But I'm just excited that it's moving the conversation out into the bigger world. And I really thank everybody for that discussion, and Mr. O'Grady for putting that so succinctly. I think it's a big step for the dairy industry.
I just, before we move to general discussion, I have one suggested change to the draft, which is, if it's not too much work, whether we could do an executive summary, which I think might also advance the answer to Senator Brock's concern. If we have a summary of the proposals, I think it might make it easier to, not necessarily sure to quantify, but at least to see collectively what the impact of the proposals might be in terms of the longer and shorter term sustainability on the industry. So would that be doable, Mike?
Sure, but what are you basically asking for, a listing?
Yeah, some kind of, maybe two pages extract of a summary form of the different sections and proposals. Representative Marcotte.
Just a couple more things. When we talked about the milk commission, would it be possible to list the members of the milk commission?
Sure.
I mean, I don't know who's on the milk committee. I'm sure I can find it without any problem, but I think within the report, I think it would be good for people reading it to know who sits on the milk commission. And then when we, on page 16 and 17, when we talk about fees and taxes, we're kind of mixing those both together. And I'm wondering, I just remember former Senator Brannigan, when she was on Ways and Means in the House, a fee is not a tax, a fee is a fee. So I don't know that they're interchangeable or not, but I just remember that discussion being had on the floor many times.
It's a valid point. The Supreme Court has said, the Vermont Supreme Court has said, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's the effect. If it's being assessed to raise revenue, that's then appropriated for whatever program, that's a tax. If it's assessed to cover the cost to the state of its services, then that's a fee. Maine calls its assessment on milk a fee. It's really a tax, right? And so you have that. There's a milk handler fee already in Vermont. It's arguable whether it's definitely part fee. It's used for agency costs, but it's also part tax. So it doesn't really. Representative Brannigan always made that point, and it's a good point. But in implementation, you can call it whatever you want to call it. It's how it operates, which really is the important part of it.
So within the context of the report, it's kind of switching back and forth. Is that?
Well, for example, Senator Brock's proposal on the packaged milk, that's a tax, but it's called a fee, but it really is in effect a tax because it's raising revenue to be used. It's not paying for state agency costs. It's a tax.
But if it was to be used to augment the Agency of Commerce capability to do advertising, then it would be more of a fee.
You could set it up in a way that looks much more like a fee. You could, and basically you create the program, and then in order to pay for the program, there would be a fee assessed on the package. It could be done in a way to make it look like a fee.
That was your concluding the fee versus tax.
Yeah, I'm just,
Okay.
because we're using
Very good.
both in the same
Yeah,
It's very good.
context.
fees sell a lot better than.
So they sound a little better than the tax, right?
Are there any other draft suggestions, or otherwise we'll use Senator Brock's comment as the jumping off point for discussion? John O'Brien, you have your hand up for more comment about the draft, or would you like to lead off with general discussion?
It can be both. It can be transitional. Yeah,
Okay.
I just think that the more I learn about the dairy industry, it seems the less I know. Getting to Mike's point about the Vermont Milk Commission, not only do I not really know who serves on it, but I don't even know what they're really tasked with. I mean, does anybody have a definitive description of what they do?
Yeah, John, we set that up years ago. And
You didn't set it up. It got set up in the 1930s, Bob.
Well-
Maybe you set it up.
well, it was there, but it turned into doing nothing like it is now. But it has very broad authority. And it the Vermont Milk Commission could do all the stuff we're doing and more besides if they so chose. But I'm on that committee and we haven't met for 2 or 3 years to my knowledge. And so, I mean, the commissioner or secretary is the chair of that. And, depending on who's sitting there in that position, they're the ones that, regulate the meetings or call the meetings, and it hasn't been used to anywhere near to its maximum capabilities.
So, John, in my experience, there's this dynamic between the legislatures and the milk commissions around the country, where sometimes the milk commissions are proactive and sometimes they're not. And the legislatures at different times prompt the milk commissions to take action. Same discussions going on in Arkansas right now. There's a milk commission that's 10 years ago went active and tried to figure out what to do, and then went dormant, and now the legislature in Arkansas is directing them to take action. So I think the dynamic here is, and conversely in California, the milk commission went way out ahead of everybody for a long, long time and really turned the dairy industry upside down all by itself without much impetus from the legislature. So I think we're in that, it's a federalist dynamic. It's state and federal government, federal market order, state order, over order program, how changes in the industry, state to federal, affect that. And there's been more emphasis on the federal program from the 1930s to the 1970s. And that put the state programs in dormancy. And now we're kind of coming back to the idea of the states needing to take action because the federal program seems to be having a less beneficial impact. So it's an ongoing, dialogue. And Bobby sits in the middle because he's a legislator on the Milk Commission. So, yeah.
You got a list, Mike?
Yep. So Secretary Tebbets, Jane Clifford, Linda Berlin, Senator Starr, Representative Terry Norris, Jerry Booth, and Reg Chapin.
Did you get that, John?
Yeah. And Mike's report, the one other question I had was that we talked about it a lot, how Vermont milk is staying more in-state and turning into value added. But I wondered how, traditionally, if a lot of Vermont raw milks supplied the Boston market or even further, what's replaced that? Where does Boston and New York get its fluid milk from now? Has it transitioned to New York and Pennsylvania, or even, as far as California?
So in 2000, before 2000, there were 3 federal orders in operation for the Northeast market. There was one for the Boston market, one for the New York City market, and one for the Philadelphia market. And so pre-2000, Vermont was the primary supplier for the Boston market. New York was secondary, and then the other New England states filled in the supply. And when the market orders were consolidated, in 2000, the 3 orders were consolidated into one. So at that point, the Boston market got absorbed for purposes of the regulation into the other 2. And the supply patterns followed that consolidation. So New York's involvement in supplying the Boston market came up because now New York makes 5 times the volume of milk as Vermont. So there's a lot of milk to move. So it got easier for the New York milk to move into the Boston plants. At the same time, the demand for fluid milk was reduced. So the need for supply came down. At the same time, the availability of supply went up. So the Boston market is now being supplied in that supply pattern. There's less consumption than is being supplied by some combination of Vermont and New York, but less from Vermont than previously.
So Dan, a lot of the infrastructure investment that's now happened in Vermont, from Mark Cabot to DFA and Ben and Jerry's, was that in response to those market orders changing, really?
No, that's a great question, and I think you have to, number one, tip your hat to Ben and Jerry, not Ben and Jerry's, Ben and Jerry. They figured out how to profit on the brand of Vermont quality that had always been recognized for the beverage milk market, how to convert that into a higher valued niche product, manufactured dairy product. And I think Cabot, simultaneously or a little bit, responding to what Ben and Jerry did. And also the market moved, the market moved to a demand for consumer preference for higher valued manufactured products. And Vermont, with its premium brand recognition, provided a real opportunity to be a leader in supplying that market. So it's a combination, I would say, of entrepreneurial ingenuity, market factors in Vermont's favor, with the market moving in that direction, and then companies moving to supply that increased consumer demand. And that is the real growth dynamic part of the dairy industry. And Vermont is really well positioned in that space. Randy, did you want to follow up on your thought to spark some more conversation, or if other people
No,
have?
I think I more or less summarized what my concern, and the concern came from really just stepping back, looking at the report in its totality, and then it reminded me of the word revitalize. And my question was, well, did we do that? And indeed, if everything that we have in this report was in fact accomplished, would it revitalize the dairy industry? And that's my question.
Well, I think, a little bit ago, John gave us some numbers from the DMC program.
Mhm.
And on the short term, if we could change that federal money coming in to the dairy farmers from 26 million to say 40 or 50 million, because we get everybody signed up with the volatility that there is in the milk business. If we had another $24 million or so coming in, that would certainly make a big difference. And during that same time, you noticed we asked to extend the life of the task force. We could be working and trying to set up a payment system on the milk produced here that's used here for ourselves to keep that money generated and coming to help pay the farmers. That was my idea about revitalizing it, is getting a more, I was going to say a more fair price, but a price that farmers can at least cover the basic expenses on their farms with, out of the value added stuff that we have worked for 20 odd years to enhance or improve. I don't know if Dan's got any comment.
Yeah, it's more than 20 years.
More.
I think I would add, Randy, that the availability of the federal funding changed the discussion from when we started, in that the Department of Financial Regulation report came out with suggestion of hedging, primarily, of coming up with hedging strategies as a revitalization tool. That was their primary suggestion. And that would be a longer term proposal, and they also suggested, further inquiry into what Bobby's talking about, the price regulation. So that was kind of where we were coming out of the financial regulation report. Then with the COVID response program and then the infrastructure program, the availability of hopefully short-term federal funding added another possibility. And I think from, the kind of going into this and in the design for this and then coming out of it while we've been conducting the task force, our attention has really been focused more towards how do we best harness the money in to provide some short-term reinvigoration and stability. So it's a two-part, short-term, long-term, that I think the report attempts to capture and really to try to take advantage of the federal money and build that back into the infrastructure. And I think the testimony, and I'm sorry Heather's not with us today, because I thought she made some really good points about how farmers' inability to do what amounts to depreciation, upgrading equipment. You can't set aside money for depreciation and then use it to upgrade your capital plan if you're not cash flowing, right? So these programs now make available the opportunity to do that, and that's a major development if we can figure out how to structure it. And that's the infrastructure, milk hauling, bulk tanks, and that, so that's a piece that's would really make a tremendous advance for the industry if they could do some catching up. So that's, I'd say, point one. And then I think to Bobby's point that we have these programs, federal hedging programs that haven't been fully taken advantage of. And they have a real opportunity to plug some part of the pricing hole. So, and to your point about quantifying, it gets difficult, but across the board, there seems to be basically a $3 hole for cost of production. And you can take farm size and keep it simple, farm size. That $3 hole is a pretty good benchmark. If labor comes in at depreciation, but and your capital expense, but $3 is a pretty reasonable number. So the numbers that John Roberts put up and Jim Mulhern testified to is $1.50 a hundredweight coming out of the DMC program. So that's potentially half the whole right there in one program. And that's a subsidy program. It's not a hedging program, it's a subsidy program. Then the two federal programs that are hedging programs are undersubscribed. So if we can encourage producers to be more actively involved in those programs, what Mike O'Grady is saying is that joint fiscal will be able to quantify for that. What's going to be the cost and what's going to be the return? But it's going to be another, significant part of that $3 hole. So, 50 cents gets us to $2 is not an unreasonable thought. So then we're 2/3 of the way there if we can encourage more farmer participation in the hedging programs. And then if there's some capital infusion for their depreciation costs, then we are going some way towards stabilizing, if not necessarily revitalizing. And then the last point would be Bobby's point that in the longer term, if we can, and this is really where we started, if we can get to a program, a state regulatory program that accounts for the change in the industry, whereby more of the milk is being used in state, and find some of that value back to the farmers, then you could see longer term revitalization. But that's the more complicated piece because the configuration of the industry is not like Maine's. So the programs that Maine is using is not a straight one-to-one translation to Vermont. Vermont actually more represents California, where you have a good milk production base, a good manufacturing base, and most of the products go out of state. For a long, long time, the state of California implemented a state price regulation program that gave great vitality to their dairy industry. So California is kind of the model. So we're trying to figure out whether we can apply that experience plus the main tiered payment experience and come up with a good program. But you know, there's a lot of steps to that, and we've been focusing on the short-term money infusion. You know, now we have a sense of how to do that. We can get back to looking at the price regulation side, and the milk use or fee is the other possibility.
You know, I agree with everything that you said. But one of the things that also worries me a little bit that we haven't, I don't think, talked about is what could go wrong on the other side of the scale, and that is how could costs begin to increase. And as I look at things like the Global Warming Solutions Act and that push to further tighten and improve water quality, again, I wonder whether or not the dairy industry is going to be impacted further in terms of restrictions and regulation that will in fact push costs the other way. I know it's very difficult to project ahead, but as you look at some of Vermont's ambitious goals, such as the reduction in the use of fossil fuels and so on, it's got to have an impact, and it's got to probably be a significant one. Just something else to think about and worry about.
Yeah.
Everyday worries. John Roberts and then John O'Brien. I saw John Roberts first.
Well, first of all, I think your just current assessment, Dan, was very good. But Senator Brock's comment, you know, I share an awful lot of that, Senator Brock. I was concerned when I was asked to join this task force that maybe there would be some unrealistic, in my estimation, goal or target that we would be sort of expected to meet. And I've been very, very pleased that it's been a very broad and thoughtful discussion about all the issues that face us. Sadly, there is no gold ring out there that we're trying to seize. I mean, I am an eternal optimist about Vermont's agriculture. I think we have a tremendous asset here in the state. And I mean agriculture broadly, not just dairy. We are a dairy state. We are, you know, and I think that's very important. I think we will continue to be a dairy state. And there are an awful lot of unknowns. You know, it's sort of befuddles me often why people don't drink as much fluid milk as I would like them to drink, because they're paying more for bottled water. They're paying more for sugared sodas that are, you know, accumulating on their waistline. You know, there's all kinds of benefits, I think, to the dairy industry, to dairy products rather, and not a lot of downsides. I do think, you know, that we have highlighted in this report a number of small but significant steps that will give farmers the opportunity. You know, agriculture, you look back at the history of agriculture from, you know, the last 1,000 years, and it's boom and bust for a number of reasons. And many of those busts brought down civilizations. So I think what we've done, or what we are doing, is highlighting some accumulative impacts. I would hope that we could put more money into advertising and really creative advertising. I think New England Dairy and others would do that if they had more money. And there certainly seems to be indications from different parts of the world that really creative advertising programs can have a significant increase in milk consumption, whether it's as milk or whether it's as dairy products. It's just, you know, I mean, there are people, we've seen them, they've written to us that, oh my God, we should be producing a Vermont milk. We should be producing a total organic industry. And none of the testimony that we have had, in my opinion, has shown that any of those particular ideas are realistic or would provide a secure dairy industry. So I do think it's a sort of inch by inch, we'll get a mile. And it's sort of sad that there isn't the brass ring. Well, I've now reduced it to a brass ring. It was a gold ring before that we could grasp. But you know, I think we're heading in a better direction. We're highlighting some of the things that we have to do. I mean, one point that we have really no control over, well, I don't know about no control over, but agriculture lends itself to economies of scale. And we've seen that. I mean, that is really, we're producing almost as much milk as we have done for 20, 40 years with significantly less cows, significantly fewer farms. And all of that, the biggest driver, I think, has been economies of scale. And in many, many ways. And unless we sort of say, okay, and this is a totally unrealistic idea, that there are limits as to how big a farm can be in order to, I'm not sure you get more farmers. You see many dairy farming is I think it says, well, actually, I'm looking at, on my other screen, I've got the letter from Catherine Durand of Agrimark that came to us this last week. You know, the dairy industry is a 24-hour-a-day business. And that, unfortunately, drives a lot of younger people away from it in many, many ways. I think some of them come back when they realize that the glories of the big city are not all they're cracked up to be. But anyway, just some random comments there.
John O'Brien.
Just to comment on Randy focusing on revitalizing, I think is an important one. And when I think of, and Mike O'Grady's word of hemorrhaging, and it was as long as I can remember, Vermont's been hemorrhaging dairy farms. So we can go back to 2000, we can go back to 1980, we can go back to 1960. You know, it's been like this the whole time. And so if this task force could somehow come up with an idea to make revitalizing synonymous with stabilizing, that would be a great success. If there was ever a point where Vermont farms at 500, you know, we got 20 years out of that would be a great success.
Well,
it hasn't been done. I don't think there's any bump up, right, in the last 60 years of Vermont dairy farms, or even a flat line.
Well, we did have 5 good years, John.
Well, that's what I wondered, Bobby. When was the industry vital last? As far as, I mean, it's always been vital as far as economically or socially or aesthetically or environmentally, but when was it really an industry where you could make money at it or go into it with the expectation that I can provide for a family?
You want the years? Well, the years we ran, we did the dairy compact, which came out of Vermont, basically. Dan can give you the years. What years were those? We didn't lose any farms to speak of at all during that period of time. if I remember right.
It did, I don't think it's been a straight line curve for, straight line for 60 years, John. And the compact, it definitely is 1996 to 2001, flattened out some. And, you know, I don't think you can really attribute that only to the compact. There are a lot of things going on at, you know, that time too. But I think the decline recently has been greater. So we're in a more precipitous decline period that we're trying to stem here. And so when dairy was a reliable industry, I think you have to go back probably to the 70s and early 80s.
No, it was rough then too. I was there.
Yeah, but you know, there were far more farms, you know, and yeah, so it's an ongoing debate, but you know, the really we are in a steeper decline period now that we're trying to stem.
And I think, Dan, you can also reflect on the fact that, you know, dairy used to be, what was it, a 3 to 5 year cycle? So you could almost go back and look at the charts and it would go up for a couple years and then it would come down and then it would go up and it would go down. So you could look ahead almost and plan on that variation. The problem began when it went down and it never came back up. I mean, and it just has gone down and down and down and down. So we just got in a free fall, and there was no way that you could look forward and say, oh, okay, so we're only getting $16 milk this year. Next year, we're going to get 21. That has stopped happening, although it is going up about that, I guess, for next year's thoughts on milk pricing. But it just got into such a decline, and there was never a rise again in that cycle. It went from 3 to 5 years to 3 to 8 years to 3 to 10 years, and then it just kept going down. And when it came back up, it didn't come up enough to make up for the losses that we suffered during the bad times. And that, I think that's what caught everybody so off guard, was that volatility in the milk price when it started.
Yeah. And so I think that's the volatility of the milk price is a pivotal difference between 2000 and the previous time. The federal support price was there as a floor, and to Bobby's point, the floor was you know, a really rough floor. It was not a floor price where you were going to make money at, but there was a floor in the market, and that floor price got removed, and so then the milk price got pegged to the commodity clearing price and became highly volatile, and then it started to ride. And hasn't recovered, number one, and then the periods of volatility have become even greater. So not only is there price insufficiency, but there's price volatility that's very difficult to budget for. And I think you could likely find a straight line correlation from the increase in price volatility to the greater loss of smaller farms. And then the aging out of producers at the same time compounds the problem. And that's where the cycle we're in now. At the same time, there's, you know, strong stalwart people that are really want to stay in farming, and that's who we're trying to support, I think, in this effort. And some producers want to stay small, and some producers have gone big. I have to confess, John Roberts, I take some issue that it's only a matter of economies of scale, because I think a lot of bigger farms have figured out that they can operate a bigger farm at perhaps a break even or a loss on the milk production and make money doing something else like a digester. You know, so then they're not really putting their operations together strictly as a function of economies of scale and cash flowing off of only milk. They're going back to a diversified operation in which when the milk price comes up enough, they can make money on milk, but when it goes down, they've got some other base to fill the hole in the cost of producing milk.
I wouldn't disagree with that, Dan. I mean, I was being very brief, but I was always struck by a comment. It's 15 years old now, but by an LFO which would have been one of the newer LFOs back then, who sort of said, to me, one reason they got bigger was because the fluctuations in the milk price just did not impact them the way they impacted the much smaller farmers. But I absolutely agree but I do think that economies of scale have given them the ability to invest money in digesters, in some of these other things. I think that's part of the climate plan is, maybe we need to provide investment for more farms to look at digesters, whether that's at all feasible for community digesters or or digesters that are more economically viable at a smaller size.
I think they're coming. Jackie, could I ask you a specific question, and then maybe we'll take a break?
Sure.
To your point about expanding the discussion outside of just the ag committees, the suggestion that we use the fee for on package sale for advertising on page 16 doesn't speak to where the money might most efficiently be used, whether it's commerce, or would you have a suggestion on where to aim the money, or should we just leave it general and have the legislature explore that?
As I recall the conversation, we were talking about, I think we were talking about ACCD doing marketing or looking into doing marketing, because they do marketing for the state now and piggybacking on some of that stuff. I think that's what we had talked about. Because we were looking at expertise outside of the dairy industry. We wanted to, have connections with programs that were already up and running in the state, but not necessarily pegging it into the Agency of Agriculture and doing kind of the same old. We were looking at some kind of out of the box marketing, for example, that they could connect. I know we have heard, I think we've heard testimony about the importance of water quality programs to farms, and is there a way that ACCD or tourism can connect advertising dollars to the purity of the farming community, the way the farming community stewards the land and that sort of thing. So that's where I recall that we had talked about.
Okay. So how about if we take a
25 of the
take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:45 and bring the discussion forward.